and I'd like to share the history of two important countries touched by the Holocaust. As soon as we hear the word Holocaust, we immediately think of Nazi Germany and of Poland. But there are two very important countries that are not immediately associated with the Holocaust: Hungary and Romania. Yet a good number of the casualties of the Holocaust years occurred exactly in these lands. We should note that Hungary and Romania were essentially borderlands, a meeting place between branches of the Church. Hungary had been the second partner in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a place where Jews were well assimilated. Romania was markedly different, being less developed than Hungary. It was associated with the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Unlike Hungary, Jews were less integrated and more marginalized in Romania. Muddling things a bit was the fact that the borders were constantly changing, which relates directly to noted Holocaust survivor Ellie Wiesel, whose town of Sighet, Romania, later became part of Nazi-occupied Hungary.
Sighet, the region's capital, wasn't much of a capital. It did, however, have a penchant for changing its name, its nationality, and thus its allegiance. When my father was born, it was a proud part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When I first saw the light of day, it belonged to the Kingdom of Greater Romania. When I left it, it was, again, a Hungarian city of noisy patriotism. Today its capital is Bucharest once more, but Budapest demands its return in the name of God knows what.
Interestingly, there's quite a paradox with respect to these two countries. There were more Jews living in Romania to begin with, some 760,000, second only to Poland, almost half of whom, 350,000, died in the Holocaust. Today, a scant 14,000 remain. There were fewer Jews living in Hungary, 480,000, but the death toll was about 500,000, more than 100% of the official number of Jews living there in 1918. Today, there are between 80,000 and 100,000 Hungarian Jews. How do we explain this? For one thing, many Hungarian Jews were so assimilated as not to be recognized in the official census. So in reality, there were an estimated 650,000 Jews present during the Holocaust era, which means that about 70% were murdered. In Hungary today, Jews are, as it were, coming out of the closet, now numbering 80 to 100,000. As for Romania, the fledgling state of Israel paid the brutal regime of Nicolae Ceausescu to allow its surviving Jewish population to emigrate to the Jewish state. In Hungary, the Jews received legal emancipation in 1867 and were given full rights, being free to vote, hold office, serve in the military, enter the professions, and so on. As a result, Jews contributed greatly to the modernization of Hungary, becoming the backbone of the middle class. It was said that no one did as much for Hungary as the Jews, which begs the question, why did Hungary do what it did during the Holocaust? Answer: the Hungarian lower middle class were simply jealous, feeling that the Jews were taking their places. Anti-Semitic groups sprang up, opposed to the evils of urbanization and hating what they called Jewish science. Add to that the fact that the social pattern of Hungarian Jews made them, as with Poland, more than conspicuous. Only 4.2% were in agriculture, compared with 60% among non-Jews. There were isolated islands of orthodoxy, while a larger percentage identified as Reform or conservative Jews. The Zionist movement in Hungary was very weak, a tragic reality in hindsight, and ironic since the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was born in Budapest. Jews felt so linked to Hungary that they preferred to remain there rather than heading to Palestine. There was almost a false sense of security since the deportations, when they finally did come, came late, after the Allies had landed and the Russians were invading from the east. The Jewish leadership basically trusted the Hungarian government. Of course, had the Jews known what was in store, they would certainly have felt different. Renowned Holocaust survivor and author of the classic memoir Night, Ellie Wiesel, commented,
The diplomats in the Western capitals knew about the Holocaust, but the Jews of Hungary did not. My elders concerned themselves with all manner of things, strategy, diplomacy, politics, and Zionism, but not with their own fate.
The next part of the story we can only understand through a historical flashback. Hungary, being on the losing side in World War I, had lost about 1/3 of its territory. Later, as the Nazis overran Europe, they returned that territory, including northern Transylvania, to Hungary. Consequently, the fate of the Jews of northern Transylvania became the fate of the Jews of the rest of Hungary. That included the family of Ellie Wiesel. Their little town of Szeged became part of Hungary. For some time, they remained untouched by the Holocaust.
The news spread through Szeged like wildfire. Soon that was all people talked about. But not for long, optimism soon revived. The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest for strategic reasons, for political reasons.
But when the deportations did come, the murder rate of Hungary's Jews was catastrophic, even worse in neighboring Romania.
And then one day all the foreign Jews were expelled from Szeged. Crammed into cattle cars by the Hungarian police, they cried silently. Standing on the station platform, we too were crying. The train disappeared over the horizon. All that was left was thick, dirty smoke.
During the interwar and World War II period, 1920 to 1944, Hungary was ruled by a Nazi collaborator named Miklos Horthy, who had a mixed legacy vis-à-vis the Jews. Ironically, he even sheltered some Jews. Toward the end of the war, he tried to break from the German alliance and please the West. Still, Hungary was the first country outside of Germany to put in place its own anti-Semitic legislation, quotas in schools and other anti-Semitic restrictions. In 1938, Hungary passed its own version of the Nuremberg laws, effectively excommunicating the Jews from society.
The Hungarian police burst into every Jewish home in town. A Jew was henceforth forbidden to own gold, jewelry, or any valuables. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities, under penalty of death. My father went down to the cellar and buried our savings. 3 days later, a new decree. Every Jew had to wear the yellow star.
We have to ask, was this a Hungarian thing, or did Germany push them into adopting such laws? Answer, this was a Hungarian initiative. Bear in mind, Hungary and Romania were allies of Germany, not occupied. They were willing, not forced accomplices. They even attacked the USSR with Germany in Operation Barbarossa of 1941. Horthy, we have to say, never planned to exterminate the Jews. There were those more extreme than him, including a right-wing fascist movement called the Arrow Cross. But Horthy wouldn't let them grow too big. Moreover, it wasn't so much in Hungary proper that we find extermination and genocide, but in occupied lands to the north and south, where real massacres took place. The crucial year was 1944, when it was clear that the Nazis were losing the war. In March 1944, the German army intensified its hold over Hungary. Horthy had to name a more extremist prime minister, named Stoje. Only then were ghettos established. On Pesach, that is Passover, came the deportations.
On the 7th day of Passover, the curtain finally rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. From that moment on, everything happened very quickly. The race toward death had begun.
Ellie Wiesel recalls the Hungarian police orders as they echoed through his small Jewish ghetto.
"Faster, faster, move, you lazy good-for-nothings," they screamed. That was when I began to hate them, and my hatred remains our only link today. They were our first oppressors. They were the first faces of hell and death.
The rounding up of Jews was done only by Hungarians. In May and June, Horthy stopped some of the deportations, but in October 1944, the Arrow Cross was put in power. That's when the deportations and the murder rate accelerated. In April 1945, the government collapsed, but for the Jews of Hungary, including the family of Ellie Wiesel, it collapsed too late. As for Horthy, how much he knew about the death camps is still debated. He was forced to resign, placed under arrest, and taken to Bavaria. At war's end, he came under the custody of U.S. troops. After appearing as a witness at the Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1948, Horthy settled and lived out his remaining years in Portugal. The degree of his culpability, his guilt, is still an issue in Holocaust research. As Ellie Wiesel noted,
Horthy, who sent 500,000 Jews to Auschwitz in 1944, is becoming a heroic figure again in his country.
as a footnote, we should mention the so-called Kastner affair. In April 1944, for reasons still debated, Nazi officials under the direction of SS officer Adolf Eichmann offered to sell the Zionist Aid and Rescue Committee, or the Va'adah, exit visas for 600 Jews who held Palestinian immigration certificates in exchange for 6.5 million tengo, about $1,600,000. The de facto leader of the Va'adah, Rudolf Kastner, entered negotiations with Eichmann personally, compiling a list of 10 categories of Jews they wanted to rescue, including Orthodox Jews, Zionists, prominent Jews, orphans, refugees, revisionists, and paying persons. The list also controversially included 388 people from Kastner's hometown, although Kastner was later criticized for putting his own family on the train. Testimony at Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 suggested that Kastner had included his family to reassure the other passengers that the train was safe and was not destined, as they feared, for Auschwitz. Kastner later became a government minister in Israel, following allegations by an Israeli court that he had collaborated with the Nazis in connection with his rescue work. He was assassinated in March 1958 by a fellow Israeli. A huge issue for us to debate is, when is collaboration and/or negotiation acceptable? If you can save lives, is it worth it, even if you were dealing with Nazis? While we're puzzling over that, let's turn again to Romania, which was on the winning side in World War I, taking territory. Geographically, it was divided into 4 lands: Romania proper, Transylvania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina. There was no organized Jewish leadership, but rather multiple Jewries. Making matters worse, the government disliked the Jews, who had to struggle for their political rights. Extreme nationalism was strong, and due to the shifting borders, many Jews in the new territories lost rights they had acquired before. There was the fiercely anti-Semitic Iron Guard, which came together in the late 1920s. The young generation, who flocked to universities and found Jews there, became jealous, launching large-scale anti-Jewish violence in the 1920s. Romania, like Hungary, was an ally of the Nazis, ruled by General Ion Antonescu, later executed as a war criminal. It's said that he exterminated half of Romania's Jews, but does that mean he saved the other half? Government policy in Romania was certainly strange, with some ups and downs. Some Jews actually saved themselves by fleeing from Hungary to Romania, where the death toll, as we learned, was lower. But things were about to get worse. In July 1940, the Soviets reoccupied the territories of Bessarabia and Bukovina. Germany hadn't told Romania that they had agreed to the Soviets retaking these territories. Then, in 1941, they insisted that Romania join Germany in attacking the USSR in order to get them back. Romanian troops advanced toward Odessa, slaughtering many, especially Jews, amid horrible atrocities. Even the SS called them barbaric. Many Ukrainians and Jews found themselves in transit camps beyond the Dnistria River. What happened next amounted to unspeakable pogroms unleashed on the inhabitants. Consequently, it wasn't only in the Nazi death camps that Jews died en masse, but in these areas called Transnistria as well. Jews elsewhere in Romania were not harmed to the degree as those in Transnistria. Nonetheless, in 1942, the Nazis put pressure on the Romanian government to hand over the Jews. The government complied. But when Antonescu realized that the Germans were about to lose the war and that he would likely be tried as a war criminal, he called a Jewish lawyer named Filderman, reminding him that he had saved some Jews. He actually asked Filderman to intercede for him and his government. But according to a very controversial report released in 2004 by a commission chaired by Ellie Wiesel, the Romanian authorities were the main perpetrators in the planning and implementation of the killing of between 280,000 to 380,000 Jews, primarily in the eastern territories Romania recovered or occupied from the Soviet Union, and in Moldova, though some estimates are even higher. Regarding his own city of Sighet, he observed,
"All that is now gone. The Jews of my city are now forgotten, erased from its memory. Before there were some 30 synagogues in Sighet. Today only one survives. The Jewish tailors, the Jewish cobblers, and the Jewish watchmakers have vanished without a trace, and strangers have taken their place."
There are even more issues to debate. How murderous was Antonescu, whose fascism was more reserved than radicals like the Iron Guard? The Iron Guard totally sympathized with Hitler and in 1941 attempted a coup. Hitler had to decide whom to support. It was Antonescu, who was perceived as a more stable ally. After German and Romanian armies suffered huge losses in the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Russians started their offensive, which would only end in Berlin, Antonescu's popularity declined sharply. He was overthrown in 1944 when soldiers rushed in and arrested him and his minister, locking them up in the palace safe. Later, they were taken by communists who handed them over to the Soviets. The Romanian troops who once fought the Soviets were now fighting with the Soviets against Germany. After returning from the Soviet Union in May 1946, Antonescu was put on trial before the Bucharest People's Tribunal, part of the communist-dominated government. He was found guilty of betraying the Romanian people, sentenced to death, and executed. There's one sad footnote to all of this. Antonescu is today seen as a war hero of sorts, a perverse form of what we can only call Holocaust denial. That, of course, is a sobering thought.